Hello everyone. Today I'm going to show you how I painted this scene in pen and watercolor. I'm working from a photograph I took of some fishing huts here on the South Island of New Zealand a few weeks ago. A lot of this video will be in real time and some will be speeded up. Let's get started. I start by taping my piece of watercolor paper to the board, and I have the board at a slight angle. Then with clean water I thoroughly wet the sky, going right down to the mountains and carefully avoiding that little chimney that sticks into the sky. I mix a big pool of color. In this case it's ultramarine blue and phthalo blue in equal quantities, and I start at the top, leaving lots of white areas that will be my clouds later. You'll notice my paper does buckle because I don't stretch it first. I don't really mind this, and I will stretch the paper after the painting has dried. I go back to my mix, adding more and more ultramarine to the mix, making sure that the sky is darker at the top and lighter at the bottom. This gives me a great sense of depth to the painting. As I move down towards the mountains, I add more and more water to my mix, again creating that sense of depth, just dragging the color and getting lighter as we get down towards the mountains. I also change my strokes from being from vertical to more horizontal and make the white patches smaller, again that aerial perspective creating a sense of depth. Now it's time to start adding some grey, in this case Paynes grey, in horizontal strokes along the bottom and along the bottom of the clouds. I'll list all the colours that I'm using in the description below so you'll know exactly what I'm using. My paper is still very wet, so everything I add is very soft and bleeding out. This is really where the magic of watercolour happens. I take a tissue, scrunched up, and just in some of the areas I dry the paper. I only do this where the paper is white, where there's no paint. I'm not lifting out paint, I'm just drying the paper so that the paint doesn't spread in there and create some hard edges to the clouds. I change to a smaller round brush, and with a much darker paint I just shape around some of the clouds. It can all look a little bit harsh at the moment and the colours can look very saturated, but remember the paper is still wet and everything will soften and dry much lighter. I darken some of the shadows with that Paynes grey, just at the bottom of the clouds, remembering to do horizontal strokes at the bottom, more puffy shapes along the bottom of the top clouds. I clean and dry my brush, and with this damp brush I just soften any areas that are bothering me. I keep going back to the water, clean my brush, dry it, and then soften an area. Clean, dry, soften. You may just notice me going back and forth to that tissue, just cleaning the brush each time before I touch the paper. Finally, I decide that I just need a touch more blue in the bottom third of the painting. So while my paper is still very wet, I can do that and it will soften out. Now it's time to grab a cup of tea and to let the sky dry completely before I do the mountains. For the mountains, I change to a much smaller round brush and I mix up a sienna, a purple, and I use the same blue mix that I used in the sky. By using that same blue mix for the shadow areas, I create a consistency throughout my painting. The mountains in my painting are quite far away, and I want the focus to be on the fishing huts. So for the mountains, I don't want any hard edges, everything nice and soft. This will create again that sense of distance, but also means that all the focus will be on the fishing huts. So I work in wet, lights and shadows bleeding into one another, changing the colors just to keep things interesting. This method of working is all about timing, about grabbing that wet bead so that you don't get any back runs and you don't get any hard edges. Painting this way really gets better with practice, but 100% cotton paper certainly helps a lot. If you're unsure at this stage, you could wet the mountains and work on damp paper, and that would give you a lot more time in which to work. I'm going to speed things up now so that you don't fall asleep. You'll notice that all the colors I use in the background, except for that sienna, are cool colors, and that I'm keeping them relatively light. Even the sienna, which is warm, I tone down by mixing it a little bit with the blues, and I don't use it at full strength. As I move towards the right, where the mountains are getting closer to us, I use slightly warmer colors and slightly more saturated colors. The shift is very subtle, but it's there. And again, we're obeying those rules of aerial perspective to give that sense of depth in the painting. Now I'm working on the mountains that are closest to us, and you'll see me add in a little bit of burnt umber, creating a lot more warmth in the mix of these mountains. They're still far away, so the mix is still quite cool and quite light. But you'll see when I zoom out and show you all the mountains that these mountains will look closer than the ones that are on the left. I don't use any masking fluid, so I'm just very careful when I go around the chimneys and around the roof lines. It's important to be consistent with shadows. I know my light is coming from the left, and so all my shadows should be on the right side of the hills. Finally, these mountains that are the closest to us, the ones on the right hand side, even more warm colors and darker darks, giving again that sense of perspective. Right, finishing off the mountains, and it's time to let them dry before I work on the big field that's in the front. The field is a big area, and I also want to work it all wet in wet, and so I wet it, but unlike the sky, I don't wet it consistently, so that I do have some areas that will allow for some sharp marks as well. This grassy field is really a lot of fun, and I get to use a lot of colors from my palette. Still obeying the aerial perspective rules, so brighter, more warm colors at the front, but I get to use a lot of different yellows, greens, browns, reds, just having some fun. You'll notice I avoid painting the road, which I'm going to add later with some greys and browns, and I carefully shape around the buildings. But other than that, this is the time when I zone out and I don't think too much. I just go with the joy of painting watercolor. Right, I'm going to speed up again. Just like the sky, where I wanted the corners to be darker, I want the same sort of effect in the bottom corners of the painting as well. So with some more vertical type strokes, I add in some darker colors in the corners. As the painting starts to dry and reach the damp phase, the paint spreads a lot less, and you can use this to your advantage to create a lot more texture in the foreground. To create even more texture, I use a little bit of salt in the foreground, and this will create some interesting marks when the paper is dry. And then covering my sky and buildings, I splatter some paints, different colors in the foreground as well to create even more marks. After the field has completely dried, it's time to work on the fishing huts. I change to a very tiny brush and I work from those back huts through to this one in the front. The back huts don't have much detail. I'm saving that all for this fishing hut that's here at the front, but I'm still working wet in wet with a range of greys and browns and dropping in a touch of dark red to create that rusted corrugated iron look. I have speeded this up because this step takes ages and you can really get lost in the detail. The light is coming from the left, so I'm concentrating on making sure that the fronts of the hut have hardly any color and the shadow side of the hut has the darker color. The fisherman's hut that's here at the front is my main focus, And this is where I use much darker colors and a lot more variation in color. All the tiny details are here too. So that the hut doesn't float above the ground, I do tend to make the bottoms of the buildings much darker than the tops. You'll see I'll add a lot more browns, and I'm shaping around the grasses there as well. As I said before, working on the huts takes a very long time and I get lost in all the details. I don't always do this all in one sitting, and there really is no rush. I'm not going to show you me painting every single window and every piece of wood, because by now I think you've got the idea. Now that the huts are done, it's time to add just a few details to this foreground. I darken the corners again, and using a tiny brush I drag in some dark grasses. I add a drop shadow and some grasses around each fence post. And then I add a few grass marks around the hut, around the track, and some various places in the field. Concentrating again on making those huts not look like they're floating above the ground, I look, the sun is coming from the left, making a cast shadow on the right, and so I put a shadow on the front hut and on all the huts right down to the back. By now you must be thinking we're almost done, and we are, except for one last step. Using my fountain pens, it's time to touch up the buildings. I start with a pen with a very fine nib and some brown ink, and I add in some details, mostly on those shadow lines. You'll see here I use an old credit card that's covered in paint to do some of the straight edges. I'm working almost entirely in the shadow areas, trying to keep the light areas nice and light so that the sun looks like it's shining on them. Once I'm finished with all the details with the brown ink across all of the huts, I change to a black ink, and in the darkest dark areas I refine some of those lines. The huts are really starting to stand out from the painting now. I change to a white marker and I add in some highlights, particularly along the roof lines and along the chimneys, and some lighter marks for some grasses as well. I add some darks and lights to the fence posts and the fencing wires in with the black pen. And then finally, with the black and the brown and the white ink, I add some grasses in the foreground as well. All that's left to do is to sign it and we're done. Thanks everyone for following along. Please let me know if you would like more videos like this, and let me know if you have any questions as well. A reminder that the materials that I've used will be listed in the description below. See you all on Facebook or Instagram. Ciao!